Okay.
Hi, I'm Rich Curtis, professor of art at Thomas University, and I'm going to demonstrate making ink out of walnuts. And so this is something I've been doing a lot lately, and some of my work is taking natural materials and creating inks or pigments out of them. So for this particular ink, I gathered a bucket full of walnuts and I let them soak overnight to allow the husk that is on the outside, this kind of spongy material, to begin to break down. And what I'm going to do is just fill a bucket . You can kind of see some of the liquid has already started to turn pretty black. The tannins in the husk is what actually makes the ink and turns it dark. You can kind of see my fingers are stained from it already. But then, so you take a hot plate or a stove and a pot that you're not going to be cooking in anymore and begin to boil the water. You want to fill the pot with water so that it covers the walnuts, and then allow it to just reduce. So you're just allowing the water to evaporate until you're left with a kind of really dark black sludge, and that is your ink. And then once you have reduced it completely and let it cool, then you want to strain it. I have a basic colander. You can use cheesecloth or other kinds of straining material, but you want to pour that liquid through and strain it. And I always pour it into glass jars just because it's a more stable container and it won't corrode or turn like a plastic or a metal container would. So this is the finished ink, and I always label it because it is an organic material. It will go bad after a while. I always refrigerate it. Some of the things that allow it to be preserved for longer periods of time, if you will add white vinegar and a handful of rock salt, and I even put a few pieces of clove into the jar just to allow it to the oils make a nice preservative, and that extends the life of the ink. Here's a test strip that I've done. I just kind of dip the ink while it's boiling. So I was saying, I like to make inks and pigments out of a lot of natural materials, and I have some examples here. Part of my process is going out and collecting the natural materials. This is clay from Alabama at 12 Mile Creek in Mobile, and so this is a nice rich red iron clay. This is a jar of rose ink. Since Thomasville is the Rose City, I thought it would be interesting to make ink out of rose petals, and so I've done that recently, 2 different batches, so it'll be interesting to kind of see the contrast. I also collect natural charcoal and various other things, and I will go through the same process of boiling down those organic materials, or in the case of clay or rocks such as oxide or the charcoal, I'll actually just crush it in a mortar and pestle or grind it on a grinding stone, and just adding water or white glue will actually make it very preservative. So some of these are just test pieces that I've done, kind of a variety of different inks, from pollen to oxide to rose ink to walnut ink. So that's one example. This is 3 different kinds of clays that I use to paint with from different rivers: the Tennessee River, the Cypress Creek, and the Ochlockonee River right up the road. Here is some of that 12 Mile Creek Mobile clay. And so I just make some different abstract designs just to kind of see how it works. So these are different clays. This is pollen. I got the idea from this on my car. I don't really have a blue truck anymore. It's pollen and rust colored now. So pollen is, of course, something we all contend with down here in South Georgia. And this is pollen from lilies that I collected. So it's a kind of an interesting yellowish to green-blue contrast. This was the pollen off of my truck, which is sort of sooty and dark. And I kind of like the way it's mostly oak pollen, oak and pine. And here's another example of that lily pollen. That's a nice bright yellow. So a lot of variety, and what I like most about these organic materials is that they have a lot of happy accidents. There's no telling what they may transform into or how they evolve over time. And just the fact that they sort of degrade over time is kind of interesting, that temporality of the materials. Another thing that I like to do is to stain my paper, and I'm going to talk some about my projects that I've been working on the past few years. And one of the first things I began to do is stain or augment the paper before I started drawing on it. So to show you some examples of staining, this is stained with different pigments, but also tea and rust. So I have a bunch of old tea bags here that I have collected, and you pour boiling water over them and then pour the resulting tea mixture onto the paper and let it soak in, and it has all of these nice varieties of different ochres and shades. I also added in some charcoal and various other things, and rust. So I live near a railroad, so it's kind of fun to go up and down the railroad when obviously trains are not coming, and collecting some railroad metal, because it's always nice and rusty and really stains the paper really well. So I will let that sit on wet paper overnight, and it just soaks in and makes all sorts of interesting colors. Here's one that's just straight tea that I poured. And this is one where the rust is really showing nicely. Some of the tea and some of the other pigments are fading into it. And I like this abstract sort of atmosphere to begin the drawing, because it kind of sets a mood in some ways. If I'm not going to be drawing with the ink itself, which is one of the projects that I've been doing, I like to use the ink and the kinds of stains to begin to affect the drawing itself. And so that sometimes I'll just use the back of the paper because this subtle staining is actually more interesting than the really intense staining on the front. So anyway, I like to experiment with a lot of different ways of creating atmospheres in the paper and shifting between that abstraction and representation. So just to show you a variety of some of the natural materials that I've been using, this is iron oxide that I collected off of a bank, a clay embankment on the side of the road in Randolph County. And in order to use it, I just dip the actual rock into some water, and I use a grinding stone. And you see that it just makes a nice puddle of this color, this pigment. And dipping your brush in water, you can begin to use it. I have my still life here, just as a way of giving me something to look at while I'm painting. This being a test strip, I'm not too concerned with accuracy. I'm just seeing how some of these colors work together. And I know that this iron oxide is going to play nicely with the 12-mile clay that I got from Mobile. This is rose ink, one of 2 batches that I made. I cooked this a little bit longer so it has a nice brown color to it. Whereas this one has a nice purple. Both colors, it's interesting, I got the reddest rose petals I could find, and yet purple and brown are the colors that I came up with when I cooked it, so you never can tell.